across the vast expanse of civilized space, where quantum communications networks hummed with the collective anxiety of 17 different species, the Trigalactic Defense Coalition had convened what historians would later describe as the most spectacularly misguided military conference in recorded galactic history. The emergency session buzzed with the kind of desperate energy that only comes when beings who consider themselves the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement suddenly realize they might be about to become extinct. The crystalline spires of the Zentorian High Command gleamed with holographic displays showing tactical readouts that would have impressed anyone who didn't know they were essentially displaying the galactic equivalent of a patient's vital signs flatlining. Representatives from every major civilization had gathered in their finest ceremonial armor and most intimidating exoskeletons, creating a visual spectacle that suggested military might while carefully avoiding any actual commitment to personal risk. Admiral Kethvar of the Mollusk Hegemony extended his primary tentacle toward the central display, where swirling clouds of malevolent energy pulsed with distinctly unfriendly intentions. "The Void Swarm," he announced with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested he'd been practicing this moment in front of a mirror, "represents an existential threat to all organic life in our galaxy cluster." His translation matrix helpfully converted his species' natural bioluminescent panic flashes into appropriately grave tones for the other delegates. The assembled representatives nodded with the synchronized gravity of beings who had spent considerable time perfecting their expressions of concerned leadership. General Fiss of the Reptilian Dominion adjusted her ceremonial battle crown, its neural interface flickering with combat algorithms she'd never actually field-tested. "Our preliminary analysis suggests conventional warfare will prove inadequate against their adaptive capabilities," she hissed, which was diplomatically polite way of saying their entire military doctrine was about as useful as a chocolate teapot against a force that literally consumed matter at the subatomic level. It was at this precise moment of collective doom contemplation that the human representative arrived, 47 minutes late, and carrying what appeared to be an assortment of brightly colored containers that looked suspiciously like the sort of thing one might pack for a particularly ambitious picnic. The security doors, designed to accommodate everything from gas-based life forms to creatures requiring personal gravity fields, seemed almost offended by the mundane simplicity of a bipedal mammal who apparently couldn't be bothered to dress appropriately for the end of civilization. "Sorry about the delay," the human announced cheerfully, settling into the designated terror seat with the casual demeanor of someone who had either completely misunderstood the nature of the crisis or possessed information that made everyone else's panic seem rather premature. "Traffic was absolutely murder coming through the Andromeda checkpoint. You'd think they'd never seen a human transport before." The silence that followed carried the weight of 17 different species simultaneously questioning their decision to include Earth in their defensive coalition. Commander Vex Thule of the Cybernetic Collective ran rapid calculations through his quantum processors, trying to determine whether the humans' apparent lack of concern represented advanced psychological warfare tactics or simply the behavioral patterns of a species too primitive to grasp existential threat. "Perhaps," Admiral Kethvar ventured delicately, "the human representative would benefit from a tactical briefing regarding the severity of our current situation." His tone suggested the sort of patience typically reserved for explaining complex concepts to very small children or particularly dense artificial intelligence. The human began opening one of the containers, revealing a substance that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed nutrition should be both blindingly colorful and capable of glowing in the dark. "Oh, I'm fully briefed on the Void Swarm situation," came the cheerful response, accompanied by the sound of something being vigorously shaken. "Nasty business that. Probably going to require some fairly direct intervention." General Tiss exchanged glances with her fellow commanders, a silent communication that roughly translated to the diplomatic equivalent of wondering whether the human had suffered some sort of transportation brain injury. The tactical displays continued their ominous pulsing, showing probability matrices that made it clear the Void Swarm's approach would render most of their defensive preparations about as effective as stern diplomatic protests against natural disasters. "The coalition has determined," Admiral Kethvar continued with the careful formality of someone delivering news he expected to be poorly received, "that Earth forces would be most effectively utilized in a reconnaissance capacity, an advance scouting mission to gather intelligence on void swarm behavioral patterns and tactical capabilities. The translation was so diplomatically sanitized it practically sparkled, but the underlying message was clear enough. They were volunteering the humans to go die first, while everyone else worked out a proper strategy. The human paused in the process of mixing what appeared to be some sort of luminescent powder with liquid that definitely violated several health and safety regulations. Reconnaissance mission, right? Solo operation, I'm assuming? The question was posed with the sort of casual interest one might show when discussing weekend plans, rather than suicide missions. The coalition forces will, naturally, provide strategic support from secured positions, General Tiss added, which was military speak for, "We'll be hiding behind our biggest shields while you go poke the universe-ending threat with a stick." The other representatives nodded solemnly, pleased with their tactical acumen in finding someone else to handle the dangerous parts of their defensive strategy. The human took a long sip of the glowing concoction, which seemed to cause some sort of internal chemical reaction that definitely wasn't covered in any xenobiology textbook. "Sounds perfectly reasonable. When do we start?" The acceptance was delivered with such straightforward enthusiasm that several delegates began reconsidering their assessment of human intelligence, though not necessarily in a positive direction. The coalition's military staging area represented the finest achievement in defensive technology that panic and unlimited resources could produce. Massive energy shields hummed with enough power to defend small planets, while weapon platforms capable of cracking moons swiveled on their mounts like mechanical predators seeking prey. The assembled forces created an impressive display of technological superiority that would have been genuinely intimidating if anyone had bothered to test whether any of it actually worked against their current enemy. Admiral Kethvar supervised the deployment of the mollusk hegemony's prized defensive system, a quantum-entangled barrier that could theoretically redirect incoming attacks into alternate dimensions. His technical specialists swarmed over the equipment with the sort of frantic efficiency that suggested they were either extremely competent or desperately trying to look busy enough to avoid personal responsibility when everything inevitably went wrong. The probability matrices indicate a 14% chance of successful defensive engagement, announced Commander Vexthul, his cybernetic implants processing tactical data with the relentless optimism of machines that hadn't yet learned to properly despair. "This represents a significant improvement over our initial projections." The fact that their initial projections had hovered somewhere around cosmic joke levels of impossibility went diplomatically unmentioned. General Thiss directed her reptilian Dominion forces through combat formations that looked spectacular and had the added benefit of keeping most of her troops well behind the first 3 layers of defensive positions. Her battle algorithms ran constant simulations, each one confirming that their strategy was tactically sound, assuming the enemy cooperated by behaving exactly like every other threat they'd previously encountered. Meanwhile, the human representative had found a relatively quiet spot near the forward observation post and appeared to be having some sort of elaborate snack time. A collection of containers, bottles, and packages was arranged with the methodical precision of someone following a very specific routine. The ongoing consumption of various powders, liquids, and what appeared to be solid fuel pellets created a chemical light show that was either impressive or deeply concerning, depending on one's perspective regarding safe dietary practices. "The human appears to be engaging in some sort of pre-combat ritual," observed Lieutenant Zexstar of the Insectoid Collective, his compound eyes tracking the systematic consumption of substances that definitely weren't appearing in any military nutrition database. The biochemical reactions suggest either advanced pharmaceutical enhancement or impending metabolic failure. The human had moved on to what appeared to be a liquid that changed colors depending on the angle of observation, creating a rainbow effect that was either scientifically fascinating or violation of several laws of physics. "Anyone want to try some of this?" The offer was made with genuine friendliness, as if sharing mysterious chemicals was perfectly normal social behavior among species preparing for potentially final battles. Admiral Kethvar's primary tentacle recoiled instinctively. "The mollusk hegemony's digestive systems are not compatible with unknown chemical compounds," he replied, with the sort of polite horror typically reserved for declining invitations to extremely dangerous social events. The other delegates murmured similar excuses though several were clearly curious about the ongoing light show. "Suit yourselves," the human replied cheerfully, proceeding to consume what appeared to be crystallized energy in tablet form. The bioelectric responses were becoming increasingly visible, creating patterns across the human skin that suggested either advanced augmentation technology or the beginning of a spectacular medical emergency. The tactical displays showed the void swarm's approach with the inexorable precision of a cosmic deadline. Long-range sensors detected distortions in space-time that indicated the enemy's ability to manipulate reality at a fundamental level, which was exactly the sort of capability that made conventional weapons feel like bringing harsh language to a matter-antimatter fight. "All coalition forces to defensive positions," Admiral Kethvar announced, his voice carrying across the staging area with the authority of someone who was absolutely certain he'd positioned himself far enough from the action to provide proper strategic oversight. The various alien military units moved with practiced efficiency toward their assigned protective positions, leaving the human alone at the forward observation post with an increasingly impressive collection of empty containers. If anything, the human seemed more present than ever, taking several collection of containers. "Void swarm contact in approximately 18 minutes, reported Commander Vexthul, his sensors tracking the approaching threat with the detached precision of technology that couldn't properly appreciate the irony of the situation. "All defensive systems are operating at optimal parameters." The fact that optimal parameters might not be remotely adequate for their current situation was left as an exercise for the reader. The human stood up, stretching with the casual confidence of someone who had either achieved perfect mental preparation or had consumed enough chemical enhancement to transcend normal concern about personal mortality. The bioelectric patterns had stabilized into something that looked distinctly non-standard for baseline human physiology, suggesting that the snack time had been considerably more sophisticated than anyone had realized. "Right then," the human announced, gathering up the empty containers with the methodical efficiency of someone cleaning up after a perfectly normal meal. "Time to go have a chat with our uninvited guests." The statement was delivered with the sort of understated enthusiasm that suggested either remarkable confidence or complete dissociation from reality. The coalition forces watched from their defensive positions as the human headed toward the forward lines, moving with a fluidity that definitely hadn't been present during the earlier diplomatic meetings. The biochemical transformation was becoming increasingly obvious, though none of the assembled military experts had quite figured out what they were actually observing. The void swarm's arrival defied every tactical projection the coalition had developed, mainly because their models had been based on the assumption that enemies would follow at least some of the basic rules of physics. The approaching mass of malevolent energy twisted through space-time like a cosmic infection, leaving reality somewhat negotiable in its wake. Long-range sensors registered readings that would have been dismissed as equipment malfunctions if they hadn't been consistently terrifying across multiple detection systems. "Contact in 30 seconds, announced Commander Vexthul, his cybernetic systems running final diagnostic checks on defensive systems that suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate. The quantum-entangled barriers hummed with enough power to relocate small asteroids, while weapon platforms that could crack planetary crusts swiveled toward targets that didn't quite exist in normal space-time. The first wave of void swarm entities manifested with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested they'd been practicing their entrance for cosmic ages. Reality rippled as creatures that were less beings and more concentrated violations of natural law poured through dimensional barriers with the enthusiastic destructiveness of universal forces that had finally found something interesting to unmake. Admiral Kethvar's primary defensive line lasted approximately 14 seconds, which was actually impressive considering the enemy's apparent ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The quantum barriers that had taken months to construct and calibrate simply ceased to function, not because they were destroyed, but because the void swarm entities politely ignored the fundamental forces that made them possible. "All defensive positions are reporting catastrophic system failures," General Teese announced, with the sort of calm that comes from watching one's carefully planned military strategies dissolve into cosmic irrelevance. Her reptilian Dominion forces retreated to secondary positions with the disciplined efficiency of troops who had drilled extensively for the possibility that their primary plans might prove completely useless. The human, meanwhile, had reached the forward engagement zone and appeared to be having an entirely different kind of battle than everyone else. What had started as competent combat performance was rapidly escalating into something that violated several basic principles of biomechanics. The biochemical enhancement process was clearly reaching its full potential, creating physical capabilities that made the Coalition's advanced technology look distinctly primitive by comparison. The human appears to be engaging Void Swarm entities in direct combat, reported Lieutenant Zextar, his compound eyes tracking movements that were becoming increasingly difficult to follow with conventional observation methods. Combat effectiveness is unprecedented. The last word was delivered with a sort of careful understatement that suggested the speaker was having trouble processing what they were actually witnessing. The Void Swarm entities, which had been casually dismantling Coalition defenses with the effortless superiority of cosmic forces dealing with inferior opposition, suddenly found themselves facing something that didn't behave according to their expectations. The human's enhanced physiology was apparently operating on principles that made dimensional manipulation seem like a reasonable response to conventional threats. Biochemical readings are off the charts, Commander Vex Thule announced, his sensors registering energy outputs that should have been impossible for organic tissue to generate or contain. The human's cellular structure is displaying properties consistent with advanced nanotechnology integration, except there's no nanotechnology present. The paradox was making his quantum processors extremely unhappy. The battle was becoming increasingly one-sided, though not in the direction anyone had predicted. Void Swarm entities that had been systematically consuming Coalition defensive systems were discovering that the humans' enhanced capabilities included some fairly direct approaches to dealing with creatures that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The combat techniques being employed were apparently effective enough to make beings that fed on the fundamental forces of reality reconsider their dietary choices. "The enemy advance has halted," General Tiss reported, with the sort of disbelief that comes from watching impossible situations resolve themselves through methods that definitely weren't covered in any military academy curriculum. Her tactical displays were showing Void Swarm entities actually retreating, which was roughly equivalent to watching natural disasters decide to take a vacation. The human's performance was escalating beyond the merely superhuman into territories that suggested the snack time had been considerably more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The various powders, liquids, and crystallized substances hadn't been casual refreshments, but rather components of a biochemical enhancement system that was apparently designed to optimize human physiology for exactly this sort of cosmic-level threat. "Are we witnessing the human's actual combat capabilities?" Admiral Kethvar asked, his tentacles writhing with the sort of nervous energy that comes from realizing one's fundamental assumptions about reality might need significant revision. The Coalition forces were discovering that their reconnaissance mission assignment had been based on a comprehensive misunderstanding of human military potential. The Void Swarm's retreat was gaining momentum, which was creating the sort of tactical situation that the Coalition's military planners had never bothered to develop contingencies for. Their defensive strategy had been based on the assumption that slowing down the enemy's advance would constitute a significant victory, not that a single enhanced human would be capable of making cosmic-level threats reconsider their expansion plans. The systematic dismantling of the Void Swarm continued with the sort of methodical efficiency that suggested the human's biochemical enhancement process had been designed by people who took their pre-workout supplements very seriously indeed. What had begun as a desperate last stand was rapidly becoming a comprehensive demonstration of why assuming primitive species are actually primitive might be a significant tactical error. The Void Swarm entities, which had spent geological ages consuming civilizations across multiple galaxies, were discovering that enhanced human physiology presented challenges they hadn't encountered in their previous cosmic meal plans. The combat techniques being employed were apparently effective enough to make beings that existed primarily as concentrated malevolent energy decide that perhaps this particular galaxy cluster wasn't worth the effort after all. "The enemy retreat is accelerating," reported Commander Vex Thule, his sensors tracking Void Swarm entities as they withdrew through the same dimensional barriers they'd used to arrive. Combat effectiveness appears to be directly proportional to the human's biochemical enhancement levels. The correlation was becoming impossible to ignore, though the implications were making his quantum processors work overtime, trying to recalculate their assumptions about human military capabilities. Admiral Kethbar observed the ongoing rout with the sort of fascination that comes from watching one's carefully constructed worldview get systematically dismantled by reality. The coalition's defensive strategy, which had been based on the assumption that advanced technology represented the pinnacle of military effectiveness, was being comprehensively outperformed by what appeared to be very sophisticated snack preparation. The human's enhancement system appears to be purpose-built for this type of engagement, General Tiss announced, her tactical algorithms finally beginning to process the possibility that Earth's military development had taken some rather different directions than anyone had anticipated. The biochemical optimization suggests extensive prior research into void swarm physiology and combat characteristics. The implications were starting to dawn on the assembled military leaders with the sort of clarity that comes from realizing one has been comprehensively outmaneuvered by a supposedly primitive species. The human's performance was reaching levels that made the coalition's advanced military technology look like the sort of equipment one might find in a particularly well-funded museum. The various alien civilizations had spent centuries developing increasingly sophisticated weapons systems and defensive technologies, while Earth had apparently focused on developing the ultimate performance enhancement program for their military personnel. "Victory is comprehensive," Lieutenant Zexstar reported, his compound eyes tracking the final void swarm entities as they retreated through dimensional barriers with the sort of haste that suggested they'd learned some valuable lessons about the inadvisability of assuming that primitive-looking species were actually primitive. The engagement was concluding with the sort of decisive outcome that the coalition had hoped for, but hadn't actually expected to achieve. The human's biochemical enhancement process was clearly beginning to wind down, the visible energy patterns stabilizing into something that looked more like baseline human physiology, though still considerably more impressive than anything the coalition had previously observed. The snack time containers were being efficiently collected and stored, suggesting that the enhancement system was designed for precise dosing and controlled duration rather than permanent modification. Earth forces have successfully completed the reconnaissance mission, Admiral Kethvar announced, with the sort of diplomatic understatement that suggested he was still processing the fact that their suicide mission had turned into a comprehensive military victory. The coalition's tactical assessment had been based on the assumption that gathering intelligence on void swarm capabilities would require significant casualties, not that a single enhanced human would be capable of making the entire threat decide to relocate to a different galaxy cluster. The aftermath of the engagement left the coalition forces in the unusual position of having won a battle they'd expected to lose against an enemy they'd considered unbeatable, using tactics they hadn't understood employed by allies they'd systematically underestimated. The various alien military leaders were beginning to reassess their assumptions about human military capabilities, though the process was being complicated by the fact that their previous assessments had been so comprehensively incorrect. The human enhancement system represents a completely different approach to military optimization, Commander Vexthul observed, his sensors analyzing the residual biochemical signatures with the sort of scientific curiosity that comes from encountering technology that operates on principles one hadn't previously considered. The integration of nutritional science with combat enhancement suggests a level of military research sophistication that our intelligence assessments completely fail to identify. The human was completing the post-engagement cleanup process with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized the entire operation, treating the defeat of a cosmic-level threat as roughly equivalent to finishing a particularly challenging workout routine. The casual attitude suggested that Earth's military preparedness included not just sophisticated enhancement systems, but also the sort of training programs that made encounters with universe-ending threats feel like routine professional obligation. Perhaps General Thiss suggested, with the sort of diplomatic delicacy that comes from realizing one species might need to significantly revise their assessment of galactic power structures, the coalition should consider developing closer military cooperation with Earth forces. The suggestion was delivered with the sort of careful respect that comes from watching someone casually accomplish what one's entire civilization had considered impossible. The universe, it seemed, had once again demonstrated its peculiar sense of humor by arranging for the most underestimated species in the coalition to possess the most effective solution to their existential crisis. The galactic community was discovering that their assumptions about primitive civilizations might need some fundamental revision, particularly when those civilizations had apparently spent their time developing the sort of biochemical enhancement systems that made advanced technology look like an interesting hobby rather than the pinnacle of military achievement. The human was now conducting what appeared to be a post-workout cool-down routine, stretching with the sort of casual satisfaction that suggested the entire cosmic-level battle had been roughly equivalent to an afternoon jog. The biochemical enhancement process had left no apparent side effects beyond what looked like the sort of healthy glow that fitness enthusiasts typically achieved after particularly successful training sessions. The Coalition's tactical database will require comprehensive revision, Admiral Kethvar announced to his staff, his tentacles gesturing toward displays that showed the complete absence of Void Swarm signatures throughout the sector. Our threat assessment protocols appear to have been based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about species classification and military potential. The admission was delivered with the sort of professional embarrassment that comes from realizing one's expertise has been comprehensively invalidated by reality. Commander Vexthul was running detailed analysis on the human's enhancement system, his quantum processors working overtime to understand the biochemical principles that had made the victory possible. The nutritional optimization appears to integrate multiple scientific disciplines in ways that our research methodologies never considered, he reported, his cybernetic systems displaying energy flow patterns that suggested Earth's scientists had achieved something approaching biochemical artistry. General Tiss was already drafting communications to her government regarding the need for immediate diplomatic revision of Earth's status within the coalition hierarchy. The Reptilian Dominion's intelligence services had apparently missed some rather significant developments in human military capability, which was the sort of oversight that could seriously affect one's career prospects in galactic politics. The human enhancement system represents a paradigm shift in military science, she observed, watching as the human efficiently packed away the last of the enhancement containers. While we focused on developing larger weapons and stronger shields, Earth appears to have concentrated on optimizing the warriors themselves. The strategic implications were becoming increasingly clear, though the process was being complicated by the fact that none of their military academies had courses covering biochemical enhancement theory. The human approached the coalition leadership with the same casual friendliness that had characterized the entire engagement, apparently treating the defeat of a cosmic-level threat as a perfectly normal conclusion to what had been advertised as a reconnaissance mission. "Right then," came the cheerful announcement. "That should keep them busy for a few centuries. Anything else you need handled while I'm in the neighborhood?" The question was delivered with such straightforward confidence that several delegates began reconsidering their species' entire approach to military preparedness. The coalition had spent considerable resources developing defensive strategies based on the assumption that advanced technology represented the ultimate expression of military capability, while Earth had apparently been quietly perfecting the art of turning their personnel into walking violations of conventional physics. Lieutenant Zextar's compound eyes tracked the human's movements with newfound professional interest. "The enhancement system appears to be completely scalable," he reported to his superiors, his insectoid analytical systems processing the implications of a military technology that could theoretically optimize entire armies rather than just individual weapons platforms. "Earth may possess the most sophisticated military science in the known galaxy, disguised as nutritional research." The irony wasn't lost on any of the assembled leaders that they'd assigned what they'd considered their most expendable ally to handle their most dangerous problem, only to discover that their expendable ally was actually their most capable military asset. The diplomatic ramifications were going to require some very careful navigation, particularly since their current defensive treaties were based on the assumption that Earth needed protection rather than being capable of providing it. "Perhaps," Admiral Kethvar suggested with the sort of diplomatic delicacy that comes from realizing one's entire strategic framework needs immediate revision, The coalition should consider restructuring our military cooperation agreements to better reflect the actual capabilities of our member species. The suggestion was delivered with the careful understatement that comes from admitting one's intelligence services had missed something fairly significant about galactic power dynamics. The humans' casual competence had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective military strategies involve very good preparation, very sophisticated science, and very careful attention to one's pre-workout nutrition routine. The galaxy was considerably safer, though several civilizations were going to need some time to adjust their assumptions about who exactly was protecting whom in their grand defensive alliance.